It's been just over 4 months since the iPhone 15 was announced at the Apple launch event in September, and since then I've been able to use it a lot, from professional client shoots to personal projects and everything in between. Now, I was using the iPhone 11 when I first got the iPhone 15 Pro Max, so it was a really big jump for me from my base level phone that was about, 4 or 5 years old at that point, to this updated kind of top-of-the-line iPhone. And as a professional videographer and photographer who's made probably over 6 figures in the last several years on iPhone content, I was most excited for the improved cameras, the addition of new lenses, the 120mm telephoto lens, and the ability to film in log video, which was something that I hadn't even imagined being able to do on a phone. So these last 4 months have included a lot of enjoyment using this phone, some disappointment about some aspects of this phone, and some surprise about features that I thought I used a lot and ended up not using pretty much at all, and some features that I thought would be pretty irrelevant to me that, I actually end up using all the time. So let's get into it. This is the iPhone 15 Pro Max review 4 months later. Now, one of the big selling points of the iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max was the lens selection. They were advertising there'd be 7 different lens options on these two phones, which is an absurd number of options. Now, the main difference between the iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max is the addition of the 5x telephoto zoom lens, which the iPhone 15 Pro only has a 3x. This was something that actually caused a lot of debate in my mind of which phone I wanted to get, and the reason for that is that I really enjoyed the 3x focal length. It's really close to an 85mm lens, and that's a lens that I really enjoy. So I went back and forth, but the reason I finally decided to go with the iPhone 15 Pro Max is because it also includes a 2x zoom, which is about a nifty 50, and when you have a nifty 50, you don't need a 72mm lens. And as I suspect, the nifty 50 kind of 48mm focal length that you have on that 2x zoom, it has quickly become one of my favorites and probably is my favorite lens on this phone. So I don't really end up missing that 3x zoom at all. The 120 gives me a perspective that I think is just really unique that I didn't have before. Now, of all the lenses, I find I use macro mode the least, and it's something that's just built into the wide angle lens, but it's still a cool feature for people who are into that type of photography. So I never really used the 28 or 35mm focal lengths, and I actually disabled the 28mm option right off the hop just because it's not one of my favorite focal lengths and I knew I'd never use it, whereas the 35 can be helpful. The wide angle camera is 13mm, and honestly, I use it quite regularly when I'm filming or shooting photos because 13mm is super wide, and also it's probably the widest lens that I have in my arsenal because I don't even have any professional camera lenses that are that wide. The video quality on this device is really excellent, and out of all the lenses, I find that I end up using the 2x zoom, which is a kind of 50mm equivalent the most, probably followed up by the 24, but I enjoy the 50mm for the compression. The 5x telephoto lens is much more difficult to film on than the 3x zoom was, and that's just because 120mm is a pretty long focal length. And when you're filming with that, it's really hard to keep your subject in shot, in frame, keep the footage smooth because the smallest movement, since you're zooming so far forward, is going to be very noticeable. Thankfully, action mode on the 5x zoom is really impressive. You do have to drop to 2.8K from 4K resolution, which is a bit of a bummer, but it really improves that footage and makes it super stable. If you don't want to drop resolution, I suggest you throw it on a DJI Osmo gimbal because I found I got really great results on the 120mm zoom length. But if you are planning on using a gimbal, make sure you turn off this setting in your phone because having this on might actually counteract the work of the gimbal and you might get some weird things happening with your footage. Additionally, make sure not to use action mode if you are using a gimbal. Now, log was the other primary kind of selling point of this phone, and having said that, very early on, as I was testing out the log footage on this, I was pretty disappointed overall with the quality. I found that the iPhone's native camera app didn't allow you to dial in the settings as much, which is something I want to do when I'm shooting log. And also, I found that the footage ended up being quite noisy, especially if there was any level of non-ideal light conditions. And you can't talk about Apple ProRes Log without talking about the massive file size. Thankfully, there's a really easy fix for this. It's been provided by Blackmagic in the form of the Blackmagic Cam app. It's a completely free app, and it allows you to jump in and dial in those settings, really fine-tune them, which is something that you're going to want to do if you are filming in log footage. And on top of that, it does provide an incredible solution for those massive file sizes, which is something that actually makes it worthwhile to use. The one thing to keep in mind though, if you're going to be utilizing that log footage and dialing in those settings, is that you're going to be using really low shutter speeds, especially if you're filming at like 24 frames per second. That's going to leave you with a shutter of 1/48 of a second, which is going to let in a lot of light, and you're going to need some kind of ND filter to cut that light coming in. as opposed to the automatic exposure compensation that you'll get with the native camera app. But no worries, there's a great solution to that I found, and I'll talk about that in just a second. So as you can see, without an ND filter, the footage is quite blown out, but we're gonna pass that and jump into settings. And for your codec, you're gonna wanna go in there, change it from ProRes, which are massive file sizes, to H.265. You are going to see a very, very small drop in quality, but with that, you're going to get a much more manageable file size and still be able to film in that Apple log. Just how much is the file size difference between the ProRes Log footage and the 4K 60 H.265 footage? Well, let's check that out. So after 4 months of use, my max battery capacity is at 98%, which means in the last 4 months, I've got kind of a 2% drop in total battery life. If this trend continues, it'll be 6% a year, and in about 4 years, that'll be 24% down, which will be leaving me at 76% battery max capacity, which honestly I'm kind of okay with because it's not super expensive to replace a battery at Apple, and at that point I probably will be ready for an upgrade anyways, considering this is something that I use for my job. I find on days with heavy use where I'm using my phone, say 7.5 hours on active screen use and about, anywhere from 30 to 90 minutes on inactive screen time, I'm burning through about 75 to 100% of my battery, which is pretty good overall considering I hardly ever use my phone that much, and if I'm using external power bank or plug it in from time to time, it's not really an issue. So coming from the iPhone 11 base model to the iPhone 15 Pro Max, I wasn't sure how I would handle the kind of increased size of the phone. And I have to say, having used it for a while, the phone is a bit too large. And this is coming from someone who has, I think fairly large hands. But with the larger Pro Max size, I'm finding that I'm having a little bit of difficulty kind of accessing the action button, which is new on this phone, or the dynamic island or control center. And when I want to kind of use it one-handed, I kind of have to have this kind of precarious balance that I'm having with my hand and the phone. It's not super ideal, or I've got to use both my hands. And to be honest, I'm a little ashamed to say this, I'm using this phone a little bit more like boomers and maybe my parents would, where I'm actually even using my kind of index finger to scroll because it's just large, and reaching from kind of the top to the bottom of the screen with my thumb is a little uncomfortable. My biggest complaint is the 12 megapixel sensor that accompanies the telephoto and wide-angle lens, and they don't share the 48 megapixel sensor that's on the primary camera, which to me is pretty frustrating because especially with the telephoto lens, you're going to want more detail capture because you are going to be zooming up so close. And that's kind of a little bit of an issue. But it's kind of a nitpicky one because honestly, I don't really see a terrible quality when you are zoomed up close. It just would be nice if the telephoto especially did have that 48 megapixel sensor, as that added detail and information would be helpful, I think, especially if you are going to be using it professionally. But we're kind of getting into pixel peeping when we talk about that, so, let it go. Early on when I got the phone, I experienced overheating issues like a lot of people did, but they updated that right away, and I haven't had any issues with the heat of the phone since. My second big complaint is the file size of the ProRes 60 frames per second log footage and the noisy results of shooting log while in the native camera app. As I mentioned before, both of these issues can be resolved if you are using the Blackmagic Cam app, which gives you so much more control to dial in your settings and kind of ensure that it's cleaner footage and it looks great. I've been having really good results with that, as you can kind of see from these examples as well. Recently, I've been kind of interchangeably using iPhone 15 Pro Max log footage and S-Log 3 footage coming out of my Sony a7 IV to kind of craft these kind of YouTube narrative stories that I'm starting to build out. And I've been really impressed with how it's looking in comparison to how the log footage looked out of the kind of native camera app. Speaking of the native camera app, I do find that the auto lens switching is kind of irritating, especially when you are trying to record. A lot of times when you try to switch lenses, it'll kind of switch to that focal length using digital zoom as opposed to actually switching to the dedicated lens for that focal length, and it will correct itself pretty quickly, but there is a brief period where all of a sudden you're going to be having really low quality digitally zoomed footage as opposed to just using the right lens. As far as features that I thought I would use more but I actually don't use at all, I think one of the big ones is portrait mode and cinematic mode. Honestly, I thought I would use the ability to go in afterwards and alter that to my advantage and switch where focus is falling in the photo. Honestly, I don't really use it at all, but I think for average users, it will be really helpful. But as a photographer, when you're shooting a photo, you make sure to compose it and kind of make sure your focus is where you want it to be. And it's just something that I don't really use. The second feature that I thought I'd use all the time, but find that I really don't is the action button. I thought I would use that, again, all the time. I think it's a little awkward with how big my phone is, that it doesn't feel super comfortable to reach up to grab. But right now I have the action button set to the Lapse app just because I think it's kind of a cool film emulsion app that I like getting photos on. But I find that I use it fairly seldomly, but I think if maybe I programmed it to be something that was a little more useful, a little more regularly used, maybe like the Blackmagic Cam app, or, you know, something that I just use every day, I probably would use it more. Another thing I thought I'd use a lot more is action mode. I thought I'd use it all the time, but I really don't like the drop in quality from 4K to 2.8K. Obviously, there are some scenarios where it's really, really helpful, like when you're using the telephoto lens and you kind of need it. But in general, the iPhone stabilization is really, really great even without it. And I don't think it's something that you necessarily need in your everyday use, even though it's nice to have. And finally, the voice isolation in your phone calls. I've never used it. I don't know how to use it. I really want to use it. Can someone please, please, please explain to me how to use it? Because I think that'd be really, really handy living in the city when I'm on a phone call. So if you know, please let me know. But yeah, as it happens, I don't use it at all. Another thing that I never really use on this phone is the ProRes photo files. I thought being able to edit and shoot in RAW would be something that as a photographer I would use all the time. But I just find that the quality on the regular photos are really, really good, and I don't really need those RAW photos. And also the file size is just significantly larger. Like I think they're like 75 megabyte photo files. Additionally, when you do use the ProRes photo files, you lose access to kind of features like live mode, any of the additional features like switching the f-stop as an afterthought, switching focus as an afterthought, any of that's gone. And there's a lot of really cool effects that come with live as well, like long exposure or loops or things like that. And I just find when you use ProRes, you lose too many features, and also you gain a massive file that you just really probably will delete anyways, and it's just going to take up a lot of storage. If I could make any recommendations about accessories that you should buy for the iPhone 15 Pro Max if you want to use it to kind of its full potential, there's kind of three big things I would say. I would say the first thing is you need to upgrade your USB-C. One that it comes with is USB-C 2, and it's going to be really, really slow file transfer, which is really frustrating that that's the one they include. So if you are wanting fast file transfer, if you are wanting to use an external SSD, you are going to need to update that USB-C cord in there to USB-C 3 or 4. Speaking of external SSDs, with the addition of the USB-C port on this, I really do recommend that you do pick up an external SSD. I really recommend the T7 Shield from Samsung. It is linked down in my description and kind of the gear that I use. But these are really, really handy, and it just really enables you to quickly transfer any large media files from your phone straight to this in a matter of seconds. Way better than trying to airdrop stuff to your MacBook or other devices. Pick up one of these, you're not going to regret it. And finally, the third thing that I would recommend if you are wanting to utilize the video capabilities to the full extent is picking up some kind of smartphone ND filter. I really, really recommend the Brandon Lee Cage from SmallRig. I think it is absolutely incredible media production kind of setup. And with it, they include a variable ND filter, which is going to be so essential if you're wanting to film in that log video profile. It's really fantastic, and if you're filming video at all, I cannot recommend it enough. So, obviously we've talked about a lot of things, and I think it's important to say that the iPhone 15 Pro Max is not a perfect device. Some of the issues I talked about is a really, really big deal for a lot of different people and users. For other people using this phone, it didn't take enough of a step forward from its predecessor, the iPhone 14 Pro Max, and it wasn't worth the upgrade. You will always have people going back and forth over whether this is complete gold or complete trash. And maybe that can be said of pretty much any iPhone that you release, because there is such polarizing opinions on this. So if you want that kind of conclusion, maybe you should go watch someone else's review. But I think for me, all those things kind of come secondary. And the reality is, I enjoy using this phone. I have fun with it. And for the first time probably ever, I enjoy creating media on my smartphone. And for a daily use item, if that's not a measure of success, then I don't know what is.